Thank you, Lauren. That was wonderful. And it's so great to be here. It's wonderful to have like all these people in the house representing history and archaeology on both sides of these disciplines. It's wonderful to be here. And I'm so excited to finally be able to talk to Professor Stern about all this in such a great, nice, warm space, right? So let's get started with our conversation about trash. Professor Stern, did you want to start us off?
Sure. I just didn't know if you had any more slides you wanted to share in the intro, but that's fine. But I thought it would be really useful. We're talking, not I, we were talking about how it might be really useful for students to understand how we sort of got interested in working with materials in archaeology to begin with, what was sort of our lead in, and then we can talk about trash because it's all related, I think.
Totally related.
So I was wondering, so Professor Britt, because you're with us less frequently, could you tell us a little bit about how you got interested in archaeology more generally and what sort of drew you into a particular line of research and study?
I'd be happy to. And it's kind of ironic because it kind of dovetails a bit into your department and Professor Mancia's line of work as well. But I have a whole life prior to becoming an archaeologist in performing arts. And I got my first bachelor's degree in creative writing and performing arts. And what I liked about my writing degree was that it focused primarily on literature and medieval literature. So it was the medieval literature that sucked me in. And I had the most amazing professor at Emerson College who studied medieval literature, but she also did utopian novels as well. So I kind of got this wonderful breadth of a wide range of things and found that I was interested more in the places that I was reading about than the actual literature. And I realized I needed to go back to school to study more. So I really thought I was going to go and do more medieval and actually biblical archaeology, ironically enough. But I started another program, so I have 2 BAs. Talk about a sucker for going back to school again and again. But I went back and it was a 4-field anthropology program. And I took a field school at UMass Boston where we were excavating a site on the Cape that was a colonial site. It was a trading post. And it was sort of a no-brainer after that. I just found that I fell in love not only with sort of the history that was in my backyard, but stuff that was much more contemporary to things that I could look at and identify with. And I loved working with the documents as well. So it was kind of like once I found this sheep skeleton in in the middle of Cape Cod, there was no going back. And I decided to go on and get my PhD. Originally, I wanted to do more traditional historical archaeology, and as you guys will all find out today, I've kind of migrated from that a bit, and I'm doing more community-based and contemporary archaeology now. So I've gone from medieval to COVID archaeology, believe it or not. And so I'd like to throw that question right back at you and figure out what brought you to archaeology, and also what kept you there. Because it's always fun to sort of dive into these little disciplines, but then what fueled your passion to stay there?
Well, it's interesting because I think we probably were within, I don't know, 100 miles of each other as we started, even though we didn't know, obviously, as we started these explorations. But my interest in archaeology probably was, it sort of all sort of slowly came together. And what kept me interested really changed at different points, I think, in my life and my research trajectory. So I always date my interest in the ancient world and the Greek and Roman world specifically to my 2nd grade teacher, who we were reading Doller's Book of Greek Myths. And then he took my reading group. I was in 2nd grade. It was obviously really memorable. He took us to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston to look at, different painted vases, red figure vases, black figure vases, that depicted some of the myths that we had been reading about. And that was sort of it. And I think I only realized later that the sort of coming together of the text and the stories and the imaginative part and the concrete, which was sort of pulled me in. I took Latin in junior high school until they canceled it at my school. And I had amazing high school teachers. I had sort of by chance, I had an amazing Greek history teacher in high school. And when I went to college, I studied classics. But through that, when I was 16, I actually went and I worked on an excavation in a place called Sepphoris or Sippori in Israel. And once I was in the dirt, it was totally over, because then again, I had this moment of seeing the things that I was interested in, just you'd say like in vivo, but sort of not, right? And you just either love getting dirty and just like sitting there like barefoot trying to peel layers off of a mosaic. You either like it or you don't. But I think if you like it, you just sort of love it. So that was still when I was in high school. It sort of drew me in, and I studied Greek and Latin when I was in college. And I ended up in my PhD program totally by accident. But I went to a place that was really cross-disciplinary. So my PhD was in religion, but they allowed me to take seminars in classics and to excavate in the summer. So I think it was just sort of the ongoing experiences, whether it was in Israel or in Greece or in Jordan, that just, there's something really tangible about history when you're studying it from that vantage. You realize that that people of the past are not an abstraction, because the last person who held, a pot of which you have a teeny tiny piece lived, 1,000 years ago or something like that. So for me, it really, I had this interest in the historical past, but I think that piece of it really drew me in. And I will say that has really continued in a certain way, because even with my most recent past project on graffiti, one of the things that I loved about it was sort of crawling around these caves, because you have to like dirt, right? If you're an archaeologist, you have to like it. You go into, was crawling around these caves and knowing that somebody carved this thing on the wall, and the last person to have put that impression on the wall was a person who lived in the year 300, 400, 500. It's still, even though as historians and archaeologists, we know that the past is not an unmediated reality, but there's still something a little bit thrilling about feeling that direct connection to the past in a really physical, palpable way. And I think that sort of feeling is what keeps me going, which is why it's hard for me to do research out of the field, and my field is farther away than your field, because it's part of what feeds my interest, sort of an ongoing interest in the daily lives of people who lived a long time ago. And often, because those features of antiquity are often traditionally neglected by people, you sort of have to go and do the work yourself and review the work yourself. So I love that. I like just having the opportunity and the imperative to do that. That's sort of what keeps me going. So what about you? What after those initial projects, what made you shift from working more in historical archaeology to sort of changing? What makes you sort of more passionate about what you're working on now? Why do you think you made that shift?
I think it's a really good question. I started to look more at heritage and sort of heritage tourism, and seeing the impacts of pretty much what you just described, the impacts of the tangible past on present day realities. And I've realized that I don't actually excavate to learn necessarily about the past. I excavate, and I want to do archaeology because I want to change the future. And so most of the work that I do has sort of migrated to community-based approaches, where communities can use the archaeology or the heritage, however it's interpreted, to sort of right wrongs, or to try and address and redress injustices of the past. So I've primarily have always focused on the African diaspora in the US, from Underground Railroad sites up to now, where I'm working with a benevolent society of all African American women from the 19th century that has ties to Underground Railroad. So it's kind of ironic that my world continues to sort of work in this circular fashion. But I find the actual interpretation of objects, I think that's the reason why I got drawn into museums and tourism so heavily, is because I find that the the impact that the objects have, that the artifacts have, the stories that they can tell, the multiple stories, are just so amazing and can give voice to the voiceless. I think I saw this most prevalently when, although I didn't work at the site, I had dear friends that did, at the President's House in Philadelphia. So it was the original sort of White House, right? And when they found the former enslaved African area and the bricks that were associated with it, the public just wanted a piece of that brick to hold on to as part of their ancestors. And I found that just so powerful, that a piece of brick can hold so much power, right? And the space in and of itself, I mean, one thing that I'm sort of that's keeping me really engaged more in trying to bridge this performance background I have with this more scientific one is looking now also at the sensory aspects and the somatic aspects of historic sites, particularly for spaces that have an ancestral quality for people that don't necessarily have a written past, right? So there's this aspect of narration that can take place through the arts that can access, sort of bridging the tangible to the intangible, that I just find really amazing. And that really kind of keeps me going, is trying to figure out new ways of exploring and interpreting the past so that it's not just three pretty bowls, you know, in a white box in a museum somewhere, but rather that story can actually help change some sort of a future for that community. So that's definitely been one of my goals of holding me here, despite, you know, the lack of jobs at times, or you know, other types of frustrations. I managed to graduate my PhD at the height of the last depression, so it was not really a job market, right? So trying to make sure that I kept that spark alive has been really, really awesome in this sense. Yeah.
And it's really fun. I just want to say, and I appreciate that a lot. Every time Professor Britt opens her mouth, I feel like cheering, because so many of the types of things, so much of what she says, even though I'll address you, right? So much of what Professor Britt says when she's describing the present and sort of the value of objects, the value of the non-aesthetic, strictly speaking, this is exactly the type of thing that interests me most about the past as well. Sort of trying to understand different narratives about the past that have not been forged by the victors, right? But the ones that sort of objects that represent people whose lives are otherwise entirely unrecorded. And in terms of the ways in which that sort of impacts the day-to-day, certainly even if I'm working in the Middle East or somewhere around there, there are many ways in which sort of narratives about the past very much shape people's understandings of the present and their connectedness to the land, their connectedness to their, you know, their sort of familial past or ancestral past. So much of what you describe is particularly acute in the more recent past, but also in the past that's farther back. So I appreciate certainly the way you framed it here. Are you ready? Are you ready to talk about trash? Okay, so Professor Britt, what do you love about trash? Or maybe I shouldn't assume you love it. What do you sort of like about trash?
I do love it. I think what's really funny is I think we were talking about this last night when we were prepping for this, Professor Stern, is that what was ironic when I started college, or when I started graduate school, and when I was just about ready to move to New York City, one of the few books that I moved to sort of help me navigate from a Boston urban life to a New York City urban life was this amazing book. And the reason why I bought it was because it told me what days and what neighborhoods contained the best trash nights. And it was because I could actually furnish my apartment or go, you know, sort of trash spelunking, so to speak. I actually furnished my entire apartment with a roommate in Boston, primarily through trash. It was wonderful. We got TVs, we got, you know, tables, chairs, you name it, it was there. So my love for trash goes deep, as well as my love for vintage, which some people might, put in that trash category, depending upon how they see vintage. So I think that love sort of grew from there. But there's so much you can gain from trash, so much information. And do you mind if I start to share some of my slides? Because I want to show some of the aspects of trash that we can kind of talk about from a historical concept. Let me just get to my screen. Okay. So I'll talk a little bit about this in a second. This is an organization that I'm working with now, and some of the work that I'm doing with some colleagues of more contemporary work. But these were sort of the questions that we were talking about today. And what I love about trash is because it's a primary source, right? Depending upon where it's from, you get so much information from it. We all know that primary sources are texts, they're newspapers, they're accounts from a topic from people with direct connection to it, and artifacts and objects, depending upon their context, provide such a rich amount of information that I just love it. Secondary sources too, even when an object, particularly from a trash, depending on what type of trash, as we'll talk about in a sec, also provides immense amount of information, which is another reason why I love trash. So depending upon where objects are found, I work in historic context in the US. So this primarily means the modern historic period from, about 1609 and up, right? About colonial period on up. And there are obviously objects and a whole set of archaeological inquiries pre that, and indigenous archaeology. I hate using the term prehistoric archaeology, but for lack of a better term at the moment, I like to call it deep time. But for my own purpose and my own research, I focus primarily on the historic period. So looking at things with documents as well as objects. And there's so much that we can learn from. So I want to get right into sort of going from present back into the time. Back to deep time. And this is a colleague of mine from the University of Chicago, Professor Shannon Lee Doughty, and she's done this amazing work in looking at disaster debris from Katrina. So not only did she look at New Orleans post-Katrina, she was the city archaeologist at the time, and she looked at how people related to vintage items, speaking about love for vintage, tourism souvenirs, items that they would sell. If anyone's been to New Orleans, particularly in the Latin Quarter, they know of these sort of like small items that are sold everywhere. But she also looked at how the disaster debris from Katrina was dealt with and deposited, and how it will eventually affect the neighborhood and the communities next to which it was dumped, and how it also started to create. She got to look at sort of site formation processes from a very present perspective, and the aspect particularly dealing with climate change and pollution and all the toxins that are related to the debris. Her book called Patina, A Profound Archaeology, and is an amazing piece, and would recommend it for anyone that is interested in looking at more contemporary looking at trash. There's also been lots of work done in the UK. So Dr. Jonathan Gardner has been looking at rubble and ruins and trash, and how the British have been depositing waste, like literally looking at how waste has been created and deposited over time. He looked at things from the World's Fair sites of the Great Exhibition in 1851. He looked at New York City World's Fairs and the London 2012 Olympic and Paralympic Games. And he's now looking at these reimagining British waste landscapes. So looking at waste as a form of archaeology. Particularly, this picture to the right is a picture of an eroded coastline at North Berwick, East Beach. And you can see, for any student that's out there who's taken probably any of our classes, could see the strata really well of each level of trash that's built up over time. One of the real popular ones is a friend and colleague, Rebecca Graff, who's studied World's Fairs. World's Fairs and the debris that they've left behind have created this wealth of information, not only of what people used to build these spaces. Things like the World's Fair were supposed to be temporary, but a lot of it was not, which was ironic, but also what did they discard? How did they discard it? Where did they discard it? And what's interesting enough is the reason why a lot of this was excavated in Chicago is because it's the site of the Obama Library. So a lot of it is tied directly into a lot of the historic preservation laws and regulations that govern the US. And then you have people studying landfill and land making. This is Dr. Joseph Schuldenrein. He's here in New York City. He's the president and principal archaeologist of Geoarchaeology Research Associates. And this picture on the right is actually looking at what's called cribbing. And cribbing was a way that New Yorkers created land by filling these boxes filled with trash and sinking them to the bottom of either the Hudson or the East River to change the landscape of the city. And you can see really well from this map, the original shoreline is this white part that comes down to sort of lower Manhattan where the Wall Street was, and the darker black outlines. But as you can see from 1650 all the way out to 1980, how much the New York City coastline has changed. And this is all trash. It's all landfill. And it's, if you look at the area, and if you think back to Hurricane Sandy, for any of you that remember that, if you look at the area that was hit pretty hard during Hurricane Sandy in lower Manhattan, most of the areas that were heavily impacted, like South Street Seaport, which is down over here, were in areas that are landfilled. And that's one real deep tie between landfilling and climate change, and why so many spaces, cities and others, towns and smaller cities located on water are having so many issues in regards to major climate change disasters. But then you get to the fun stuff, the stuff that many people are probably really used to seeing when it comes to trash, and they're privies and cisterns. So for those of you that don't know what a privy is, it's an old outhouse, and these are, for a historic archaeologist, a gold mine. Why? Because once a privy was no longer needed, no longer in use because there were now indoor plumbing, privies were filled with trash, and you could actually date things in there based on the strata of when things were placed in. Sometimes they were cleaned out on a regular basis as well, so you might be able to get even more information from that. Not all privies, however, are attached to one family, so that could be problematic. You can't necessarily tell the information is directly associated with a particular family or individual. But in this case that you see here, this is a privy from Boston. This was actually a site that I used for my senior thesis when I was an undergrad at UMass Boston. And you can look at the top right, and that is known as Catherine Nanny Naylor's privy. And that dark stuff on the bottom is exactly what you think that might be. It was capped with clay, and so everything in that privy was really, really well preserved due to the waterlogged aspect, and all these organic materials were preserved, including eggshells, hair, and these amazing pieces that you see below. So you see up top a bone, it's really kind of hard to see, but this is a bone needle case that I studied. There's a bowling ball in the center, which is the oldest bowling ball in America that has been found. And it was illegal at this time in the 17th century to bowl because of Puritan laws that govern the city. So seeing this, you actually have sort of this contraband information here when you see this bowling ball. And these other two pieces that you see below, one is a silk sleeve on the right, and the other is a piece of lace. both pieces of information start to tell us a little bit more about who used these. A silk sleeve would have been used by someone with lots of money that had an elite status. The fact that someone could have a bowling ball as well, another illegal item, probably is because this person had some status. And Catherine Nanny Naylor's tale is one that we could probably spend an entire semester studying. Her tale is amazing. But Catherine Nanny was actually a woman who was granted a divorce in the 17th century because she suffered from domestic abuse from her first husband. And her story is one that is just filled with so much wonderful information from documents to these wonderful objects. If you're interested in more, I highly recommend looking at the Boston Archaeology Facebook page that tells you more and has more information, or you can go to the Boston Archaeology, the City of Boston Archaeology's website as well. Cisterns, though, and this is sort of what started my love for trash and how I got involved with more Underground Railroad and African diaspora information, is that my dissertation site was located in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, at the site of Thaddeus Stevens' former law offices and home. He lived there with his housekeeper and confidant, Lydia Hamilton Smith, an African-American woman that you see below. And his cisterns and privies that you see over here on the top left, actually they're just two cisterns, provided a wealth of information, not only because they had trash, like a lot of cisterns and privies did once they were not used, but this cistern was very specific and very unique. It was hard and I couldn't find any photos. I unfortunately lost all of my dissertation material with the crash of a computer. But this cistern that you see here abutted a saloon that Stevens owned but did not operate. And it had, when we excavated it, we found that there was sort of like a makeshift window that you could tell the original construction was destroyed and redone. That makeshift window led directly to a space in the Kleist Saloon basement that was modified as well. So you could tell someone modified this and modified this window, but the key clincher was this spittoon that you see in the bottom. This spittoon was sitting upright in the corner in the cistern. And when we excavated this looked really strange. Most trash, as you know, think about the way you throw things in the trash can as anyone would. You throw them in, you don't think about it. This looked deliberately placed. And we hypothesized that Stevens was actually hiding African Americans escaping on the Underground Railroad. We knew he had connections, but we thought this provided a material piece of evidence. Since these excavations, they have found documentary evidence that confirms this. So it's really interesting how the artifacts have come and the documents then support it. Usually it's the opposite way around. But that's sort of my real interest in trash. If we go back in time even further to indigenous archaeology here in the US, you can look at lithic scatter as trash. So when you're thinking of groups making stone tools, this is all obsidian, so volcanic rock. Think of a campsite or a tool processing site. This is trash. But for us, it's wonderful pieces of information about how stone tools were made, when, where, what type of material, where did they source it, and what was it used for. So these types of information is really what drives me to trash. This is my plug at the very end that I will do for my urban archaeology lab. But I don't want to take up too much time. I want to ask Professor Stern why you love trash and what brings you to study trash on a regular basis.
Oop, Professor Stern, you're on mute.
Okay, you guys might actually get to hear recorder practice too, so it's a bonus. Trash and recorder. The toe and spinal tap. So much of what Professor Britt just said really resonated with me, and we can talk about our dissertation photos at another time. So That said, I also really appreciated the bowling ball that you showed us, and it reminded me of one of my favorite, when I lived in St. Louis, Missouri, one of my favorite museums was the International Bowling Museum and Hall of Fame, which did have a diorama of Martin Luther bowling also, but unfortunately, I think it no longer exists. But it did sort of resurrect those memories for me as well. So for me, I'm going to show you guys a few different examples of the way we can spin trash, I guess, maybe figuratively more than literally here, because there are lots of different ways that I like it, and some of which I alluded to before, and some of which I just sort of echo what Professor Britt just said. Because what we get in history a lot, particularly from literary sources, when we're lucky enough to have them at all, is that people lie or people don't know. And they write things about what other people do and how other people behave, but they either deliberately miscast it or they're uninformed, especially when we're talking about the distant past. I mean, we've seen just now how archaeology can really illuminate the more recent past in ways we otherwise wouldn't fully understand without archaeology. And that reality is sort of intensified when we talk about the more distant past too. So what I like about trash is whether it's trash, again, I don't know if you guys can hear that recorder. What I like about trash is both sort of looking at what people today, sort of modern scholars, have considered to be trash and have overlooked, or what ancient people considered to be no longer important and discarded as we would understand to be trash today. By examining those materials, both of those materials, we can understand the past from a very different vantage than we would using the guide of literary sources. This is one of the most dangerous things I think that even archaeologists often do, is that they use literature as a framework to interpret the archaeology. And one of the things that I like to do is flip it. So say, how can we differently interpret what we think we know about the past that is based on literary evidence? How can we differently interpret it if we use the material evidence as the framework, right? So that's what interests me most. And one of the examples from my last book on graffiti was the ability to look at sort of the archaeological record and then differently interpret something in rabbinic text that had been read traditionally in different ways based on what we knew about the reality on the ground. And I'll show you some slides of that in a minute. But really this is, so as I said, I'm going to show you two different types of trash, but trash, as we can see, is really a relative term, right? Trash to one person is not trash to another. So if you look at this image from the Lower East Side, the people who created these different types of graffiti using, different types of techniques and that sort of thing, to many of their creators, what they were producing was artistic. To other people, they might see it as defacement of public property or vandalism, right? So it's all relative. And likewise, I think this example, I think this is a photo from 2017, because the graffiti on top of the projected graffiti, the sort of throw up, as it's called, right, is more recent. But I think it's a great example because Banksy, asterisk, okay, whoever Banksy is, right, left traces of presence throughout New York City, including this place on 79th and Broadway on the Upper West Side. And what you don't see here, which has been subsequently put up, and I forgot that wasn't in the image, is that Zabar's, the food store Zabar's, sponsored the plexiglass to protect what was technically sort of an illegal act of vandalism, right? Banksy threw this up overnight. Then they used the plexiglass to protect it because now his work is considered what it might not have been considered, let's say 2 decades ago. It's considered sort of a more venerated form of artistic expression. And then you have on top of the plexiglass, somebody sort of writes on top, "Let the streets decide," right? And I think it just shows how many different, it's, I think Safat asked, yes, it's an interactive graffiti. I actually love looking at this and then looking at ancient examples because you really see how a 2-dimensional image is interfacing with a 3-dimensional object of current utility, right? So it looks like he's smashing the fire hydrant, but that's just 2-dimensional. So it's something that really is sort of an interactive urban feature. even though it's a two-dimensional image on the wall, a stencil. So to some, this is now so Banksy's work is now not trash. To other people, they would still consider it to be trash. And to some people, they say, you can't, there's no sort of official, there are lots of different ways to read it, and I don't want to read it for you guys, but I just think it's an example of how many different perspectives we can have packed into one image. That now Zabar's is sponsoring the protection of something that 20 years ago would have been painted over immediately. And the streets are saying, no, we're the ones who decide who is a true street artist, okay? So trash is really relative. And that is why a lot of my more recent study on graffiti and antiquity has really resonated with me, because traditionally archaeologists really dismissed a lot of the images, forms of writing. And that's one of the reasons why I appreciate not liking the term like prehistory, right? Because there are lots of different reasons, but there are lots of different forms of communication, media of communication, images, texts. Their agency and efficacy are really sort of overlapping. But traditionally, when people who are archaeologists studying, let's say, the 6th century BCE to the 6th century CE, so a 1,000-year span, when they would find these types of markings in burial caves, inside synagogues, inside churches, they wouldn't really report them because they just considered them to be the ugly stuff, the incidental stuff. Why I found them so interesting is because they actually show us how these spaces were used in antiquity. There is no literary source that said, when Jews and their neighbors throughout the Levant would visit a burial space, this is what they would do. There's sort of a rabbinic text that talks about it, but there's no text that said this is what people do. We only know that they did it because we're paying attention to what archaeologists traditionally consider to be trash, if that makes sense. So I'm just going to show you a few examples of this sort of thing. This is from a really old, sort of like a still of a really old like Google map. One of the places where I did a lot of field work is in this place called Beit Sha'arim National Park. It is in Israel. This is Jordan right here. This is Lebanon up here. This is the Mediterranean right here. Beit Sha'arim is like a 20-minute drive from modern Haifa. It's about 20 kilometers, so 20 minutes with traffic and this sort of thing. Not a lot of it, actually, only a third of Beit Sha'arim has actually been excavated. So I would love to know what's in the remaining 2/3, but we can footnote that, and that might not be relevant to you guys. But it's become a national park. It's been recognized. It's not a UNESCO World Heritage Site, but it's gotten some stamp or something like this. And it really was the when I lived in LA, a Hollywood Forever cemetery. It's like if you are the elite of Hollywood, there's a certain place where you want to be buried. And at the time when this necropolis was in use, this sort of burial space was in use, it was sort of the same thing for Jews, mostly throughout Syria, Lebanon, regions of those places today, maybe into Jordan and the area of modern Israel. So it's from the time that we sort of date to Roman Palestine for lots of different reasons. It seems like these catacombs were in use from the 2nd to 6th centuries CE of the Common Era. And part of why they were considered to be the where it's at place to be buried for Jews of the time was because Rabbi Judah the Prince, the redactor of the Mishnah, was sort of thought to have been buried there. Now, a lot of the exteriors of these catacombs, because they're actually tombs that are sort of dug into the rock, they're sort of hillsides and they're excavated into the rock. A lot more energy has been expended. I think it's actually a relatively understudied site for the largest necropolis of the time and region, but be that as it may. But the monumental architecture, which here, if you were to visit it, has been reconstructed. But that has occupied a lot more attention. So too are these doors, which you can see, which sort of are stone, but look like brass studded wooden doors. You find these in churches, sometimes throughout the region, up here through Syria, sometimes made of basalt. There's one from a Christian context that's actually on display in the Met, but this is sort of conventional. But they have door knockers. They look like you're just coming on home. But throughout these catacombs, which are, again, very well known for people who study this period in time, were a lot of markings. And this is what got me into a project that led to an entire book that archaeologists, when they reported them, they said, oh, these and other ugly incidental markings of careless visitors are throughout the catacombs. And what got me interested in the project is that I went through 3 volumes of the site report and I counted over 250 of them. It didn't seem so incidental when you have that many. And some of them are inscribed, and I usually pay more attention to those, but I won't here because I'm going to show you some other texts, but a lot look like this. So some of them are these bald figures. All of them have really prominent eyebrows, which is like a fashion trend that I think has resumed through different points in time, but they have really prominent eyebrows. Sometimes these figures have their hair standing on end. Often they're wearing these garments that could be linen shrouds. This one has sort of this man falling. The closest analog to this is actually discovered in Italy. And what seem to be gladiators fighting, sometimes menorahs, because there's actually no evidence from the exposed catacombs that anyone who is not Jewish buried there. And that's really funny about the Brezhnev thing. I wish I'd heard that before I published the book, but there's always additional work to be done. So what we know from these is that they actually not only appear throughout the catacombs, but they appear in particular places. Certain images appear in particular places, which makes sort of certain portions of a tomb, certain portions of a hallway to a tomb. And it basically demonstrates to us that this is something that people did when they would go to visit the dead in antiquity. This is what they would do, that this was not incidental. These were acts of veneration for the dead. And sometimes the evidence is very clear, especially for images like this. Traditionally, people read this as a marker that the people who had been buried inside the adjacent tomb were actually gladiators who died as gladiators. But these actually seem to be prophylactic, right? They seem to be protective because of the direction of the spears as they relate to the tomb itself, and because we see them recurring in very particular contexts, and I'm not going to show you a lot of these. So I think it was Safat's question about the Banksy, which is really useful here when we look at the sort of relationship between image and architecture and that sort of thing. It sort of tells us a little bit more about how these things could be used. So that's just sort of an overview, and I know we're short of time, but I wanted to show you 2 really important sites, both from earlier and later antiquity through modernity, actually, that were unlike the Beit Sha'arim example that I just showed you, which is sort of an example of people always thought it was trash, but actually now we realize it's not at all trash. It was wonderful, effective, right? Like people drew this for a purpose, like to affect the dead, to venerate the dead. It performs action, right, on behalf of the drawer. So even or the writer, depending on the context. So that's a case where it seemed like trash, but we should not be, trash gets in the way. And then there are actually other instances where trash qua trash is a really useful way to explore the past. And so there are 2 sites that I'm going to mention, and then I'll spend more or less time with each slide, and if you guys want to see it after. One site is indicated here. So here is Cairo, and here is the site of Oxyrhynchus, which is off of sort of a tributary from the Nile. So it was not as close to the Nile itself. So the site wasn't as susceptible to the type of annual flooding that would have placed the items in question at risk. But it became clear, it's funny because the 2 sites that I'm going to show you came to light in the 1890s. And they're great examples of how we need to continue to do archaeological work to sort of discover more information about the past. But we actually have excavations that were so rich. There's still so much work to be done with these particular archives that if any of you were to be excited about working on them, I could definitely point you in different directions. But when you're talking about caches of materials in the 500 or 400,000s, there's only so much you can work through at a time. So this is, and again, is a great example of sort of doing archaeology in the archives, the type of work that you can do, not necessarily with a trowel in the dirt or with LiDAR even, right? But doing it sort of with excavated materials. So it came to light in the 1890s that there were these papyri, scraps of papyrus. So in Egypt, this is a really popular and people say relatively inexpensive way to communicate. And papyrus is actually made out of papyrus leaves, right, that are dried and beaten. And it was basically the ancient form of paper, which is how we get the word paper. But it's preserved to a much greater degree, let's say in Egypt, both because papyrus was abundant there and because, as students who take my classes, we talk about all the time, the climate is particularly arid. Okay, so the things don't decompose like we expect them to, which is why if you go to the Met and you go, I think it's called the crypt, underneath the grand stairway of the Met, and there are a bunch of materials from Saqqara in Egypt, and we have people's shoes, right? So the degree of preservation is so much greater because of the climate. And I know I'm being really slow here, but we have amazing things from Oxyrhynchus. So Greenfell and Hunt were interested in this particular site because they knew that it was traditionally a Christian site, but they really got what they were in for, because during their excavations of these trash piles, these sort of mounds that were filled with trash, like old cabbage and old shoes, but also old papyrus, they found a breadth of otherwise, sometimes it's attested literature, sometimes unattested, just a trove of information about this particular place in antiquity. Personal letters, copies of texts from the Bible, copies of texts from the New Testament, but also from non-canonical texts, so non-canonical gospels. So we have information from this particular site about early Christianity that we would never otherwise have, about how early Christianity was practiced, even though it wasn't ultimately sort of sanctioned in ways by the church. And the process of canonization is really selective and incremental. And a lot of the texts that sort of document other people's beliefs about Jesus traditions and all these things were otherwise left out. So there were texts in Greek and Latin and Egyptian of different kinds. So Demotic, there was Pahlavi, if Miriam is still here, there's Pahlavi, there's Hieratic, there's Aramaic, there's Syriac, and there's just so much great stuff in the trash. Like we have texts documenting books of Euclid, such as this one. This is a really famous image because we have a nice little diagram, and I included sort of the translation here. This is one of the examples in Uncial Greek, and this is from book 2. This one I just want to draw attention to too, because it shows that we have things like we have Euclid's geometry, we have otherwise lost texts of Aristotle that were just piled in this sort of papyrus trash heap. But this is one of my favorites, and I was showing it to Professor Mancia and Professor Britt before, and it's a letter from a bratty kid to his father. And we only have like 3 letters from children in antiquity, and this is one of the ones that is best preserved. Basically, he's really mad because he wants his father to take him to Alexandria with him, which is sort of like the bustling place to be. And if you don't take him because of this, right? If you won't take me with you to Alexandria, I won't write you a letter or speak to you or say goodbye to you. So maybe this seems like the distant past for a lot of you, but these are the types of voices that are preserved in the trash that we otherwise wouldn't have. It's very hard to access the voices of children. And here we literally get to do it, right? A literate child who is probably a little spoiled, who is able to write. The image here is just not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily correspond with this piece of papyrus, but it's an image of a child from around the same time that the letter would have been composed, sort of depicted with these sort of conventions of both post sort of Hellenistic and Egyptian custom. There are sort of sayings of Jesus that are otherwise not documented, which really point to these very alternative traditions, alternative to what we know today, not alternative to antiquity, right? So there are lots of different Jesus traditions that coexisted, and certain of them coalesced or were sort of selected to turn into what we know today as into Christianity. But in antiquity, it was not a foregone conclusion, which points to what I was alluding to with what Professor Britt said. And I know I have no time, but I'll just point you to one other cache that's so phenomenal. Some of you might have heard of the CAIROGENIZA, which basically documents 1,000 years of stuff that was sort of shoved into a room in the Ibn Ezra synagogue in Cairo. I visited the synagogue years ago. It's a magnificent structure. It was renovated at a sort of several years ago, it was renovated for visitation. It's not used as a synagogue today. I actually really recommend, it's a phenomenal, really readable book by ADINA HOFFMAN and Peter Cole called Sacred Trash, The Lost and Found World of the CAIROGENIZA. It's a very readable introduction to sort of the phenomenon of the Geniza, sort of how these things are found and why it matters. And this is sort of from a diorama showing these people sort of entering this room. Now, why would it have been, I know we have to go, why would it have been that these materials were all collected there? Within the Jewish tradition, it is traditional that anything that has the name of God on it not be thrown away or destroyed. So rather than be thrown away in a certain type of trash, it was all basically put into a sacred depository in the synagogue itself. And this is a very famous image of Solomon Schechter, professor of Talmudic and rabbinical literature at Cambridge, trying to sift through all of these documents that really came to light at around the same time as Oxyrhynchus, so around 1896. And I'll just show you some examples of what these look like. Some of these include amulets, which I really like because they're some of the only documentation we have of women's experiences in antiquity come from what traditionally were sort of like clustered together as magical texts, but they really, some of them are very formulaic, but they also tell us about the realities of women and their conditions in the medieval period in antiquity. I don't know if I showed you this slide before, but yeah, it's basically 1,000 years of accumulation represented in this cache. So we have amulets, we have documentation of business dealings between Jewish and Muslim communities in Fatimid, Egypt, and later periods. There are letters to Maimonides, the famous sort of physician and scholar Maimonides, who attended, he came to the synagogue in Cairo, and there are letters from his family that were preserved there, both in Arabic and Judeo-Arabic. And if any of you guys are really interested in sort of following up on this sort of thing, there are lots of these projects that I've highlighted to you are particularly collaborative projects. So they're sort of multinational, scholarly, cross-disciplinary projects, whether it's for the Geniza or Oxyrhynchus. And I'm happy to give you additional information about those archives should you be interested. And I apologize for going over. And Professor Britt, you wanted to show something too about ways that students can get more involved.
I don't need to share, I can just state it, but I have an urban archaeology lab that I have for some of my students, some students I see here, I've seen, that we can actually do laboratory and clean and work on artifacts, some of it trash, some of it not, but it has room for work study students, interns that can get paid, as well as just volunteers. Unfortunately, because of COVID, it's on hiatus at the moment, but as soon as it is okay and safe to go back on a regular basis, we will be opening up the lab, and I would love to have students. I see some students here that have worked in the lab. So for those of you that have been there, you can attest that it's fun. And we've learned some really cool stuff. And we're working on New York City collections from Van Cortlandt Manor, Rufus King Manor, and I just acquired one that's in my living room from the Lower East Side. So feel free to reach out to touch base with me if you're interested in more to learn more.
Awesome. Thank you, Professor Britt and Professor Stern. I think we have, if you guys are game, we have time for questions. Do you guys have class or anything? Okay, cool. Yeah. Any questions, comments? You know, one of the things that when I was in graduate school in history, I always was jealous of my friends who were in science because they had labs and they had lots of collaborators. But archaeology is a great way for you to sort of have collaborators and still be sort of in the humanities as well as the sciences, depending on what take you take. Professor Remy.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you so much for this. This is absolutely fascinating. For those of you who don't know me, I teach and work on modern European, modern German history, and one of the most interesting to me depositories, archaeological depositories from this period, and I guess you could partly call it trash, is unexploded bombs from the First World War and Second World War which are in different parts of Europe, especially Germany, also in Asia, the Philippines, and then from the Vietnam War, especially in the American War, as the Vietnamese call it, in Vietnam, rendering, as I understand it, 25% of Vietnam's land unusable. And that's not even getting into the exfoliants and the toxic chemicals and everything. This is just bombs. So it got me thinking, you know, there are these dedicated units of engineers that run around Germany whenever one of these things is discovered, usually by some poor construction crew. But there's this whole protocol and process, and it got me thinking about the risks to archaeologists. You know, whether they're digging in or working in very, very old sources, or whether they're working in the Lower East Side today, just the physical risks, the environmental risks to you as all the people who work on these sites. I mean, there must be. I'm guessing that this would be a pretty considerable issue. I don't know.
I'm happy to talk about. Yeah, it is a considerable issue. You've got hazmat issues depending. I mean, I've worked on a site that was once a gas station, so the benzene that was associated with that. I've worked on sites where also the hazards are the community that you're doing the archaeology in, because they're being forced off their land. You know, I've been greeted with guns when I've worked at some sites. So you have a lot of, and you also have, I mean, when you're working in urban spaces, or really any space, you need to get, you sort of have to clear it, at least in the US, you clear it through utility companies to figure out where utility lines are. But there's a bunch of times where you might find more utility lines that are not necessarily marked. So there's that possible scenario, particularly for electric lines, that could be problematic. Gas lines, that could be problematic. Just worked on a project in Governor's Island where that came up, where we found new lines that we did not expect to see. So that aspect of hazardness is definitely there, I think, at all times. And you're sort of not really trained in it very well. I'll be quite honest with you, Professor Stern. I don't know if you received any training. I mean, I worked for a private company for a time being, and I also worked for FEMA for 7 years. So I have a bit more background in sort of prep work for that, but most people do not, I would state, do not. And it's interesting that you brought up the World War I information. And I think just this week, I think I just saw it in the news yesterday, that ordnance from World War II is just recently discovered in the UK. I don't remember if it was in New York. I saw it on probably a Facebook post of some sort. So they're still finding lots of information just randomly, right?
Yeah, a bunch of amateurs amateur sleuths and archaeologists, and recently completed a map of London, of sites hit in London. So you can, it's really cool. You can look up your address in London and find out if it was ever actually hit. Yeah.
I mean, on a smaller scale, a lot of times, like, unfortunately, one of the things that, I mean, this is actually something we know of from Pompeii, where the tombs were on the periphery of the city, that sometimes people would use tombs as rest areas for themselves. And people have continued to do that. So even though it's not about wiring or explosive devices per se, a lot of the tombs that I've sort of gone through, a lot of people use them as toilets. It makes for, I mean, it's sort of a less grand pronouncement in terms of the dangers of archaeology. And there's certainly other things, sort of like firing ranges nearby, that you have to make sure everything is timed really well to do the excavation, but also just sort of the mechanics of working in spaces that people no longer consider to be important. And so they can deface them, and they can also use them as toilets, which is another way to disrespect those spaces. So sometimes it's really sort of hard to know, like, what's safe and what's not, depending if you're sort of working solo or with a team. But that's sort of another, especially again, when you're not working on the monumental, a lot of times look at things that are monumental from the past as being something to respect. And then the rest of it is just trash. And so they sort of treat it that way. So that's just sort of another layer, as it were.
I should have also stated rats, working both in the Southwest and in New York City, rodents of unusual size sometimes emerge, and they've stolen, the pack rats I worked with in the Southwest actually stole all of our string and some of our equipment. And then, the Lower East Side and Boston has definite rodents of unusual size. So, there's that aspect as well to think about. Or scorpions, working in places with scorpions,
snakes,
tarantulas. Yeah, there's definitely aspects.
Any of the students have any questions? John or Nicholas or anybody?
I guess just to comment, it's intriguing to note how much how many documents are found. You just think of trash as like bits of like clay or things, just very more solid than literature necessarily. That's cool.
Yeah, I mean, in certain ways, I think we can imagine it as sort of like an ancient form of email almost. It's just sort of this hodgepodge of communication. And we do normally think of things that are more durable as providing us with information about the past, because usually things are found in areas with wetter winters or summers, or these things rot away. And actually, we know that what we see there is not entirely necessarily atypical. It's just that in so many places, the record that we have has just been destroyed by rain or other types of things. And so it really, part of what's so remarkable about it is that it gestures to the vast amounts of material we would have would environmental conditions or architectural conditions or something like this permit. It really just points to how much is out there and how much could be out there, but it shows you how much there really is to study. Depending on where your interest lies, there's really something for everyone in its own strange way. But yeah, a lot of material.
That's fascinating.
A question for Professor Britt about the bowling ball.
Sure. Is that you, Nick?
Yeah, hi. Yeah, this is Nick. Did the bowling ball only had one hole in it, didn't it?
Yes, it was sort of like, think of candlepin bowling.
Oh, okay. And also, why was bowling banned? You said something about Puritan law banning bowling in the 19th century?
Pretty much anything fun was banned in the 17th century in Puritan Boston. They had such strict laws too in terms of who could wear what, and for instance, like that silk shirt that we found could only be worn, that type of material could only be worn by someone who made a certain amount of money. If you could only wear certain styles if you made a certain amount of money. They really regulated every aspect of your life, including the fun part. So bowling was, I think, just seen as devil's work. You're doing leisurely fun activities. You're not sort of dedicating yourself to something that's more action oriented to God and to study. So it was seen as illegal. Crazy.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm turning into like this sun ghost over here. I apologize.
All right. Any other questions?
And they still bowl differently in Massachusetts. That's actually a fact.
Candlepin bowling, is that just a Massachusetts thing? Oh, sorry.
I would have said I've never heard of that.
Okay, I should have known. I used to watch it on Saturdays. So yeah, they are basically teeny pins. They don't have the like sort of egg bottom. They're just straight pins, and you have these tiny balls that you can just pick up in your hand. They don't have the 3 holes. It's great for kids. I'll just leave it at that.
Oh, so it's harder bowling. Got it.
Yeah.
But it's never going to rip your fingers off if you do it badly. You know, well, not literally, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, good to know.
All right, well, thank you both for such a fantastic, masterful, in fact, presentation, for fantastic images and ideas. And I put some stuff in the chat that I wanted to just remember that both of them said, because I think, you know, we spend time theorizing about what history is in 2001, but this was a great way of sort of melding what actually is happening in the field with what history is and what history can be. And so it was fantastic. Thank you so much. So I'll see you all next Monday at 5 o'clock for Microhistories. And until then, take care. Okay, bye.